Recently, the United Kingdom held the annual Group of Seven summit. The summit is billed as a meeting of the wealthiest liberal democracies to discuss major world issues. The leaders attending were from the UK, US, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, and Japan. These countries allege themselves to be the bulwarks of democracy and representative government in the world. They condemn countries they label as autocracies, namely China, Russia, and Iran. President Joe Biden claimed at the summit that democratic values represent everything we hope to achieve in our shared future. Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, said that the G7 nations all share the common values of openness, freedom, and democracy. The G7 nations' geopolitical goal is obviously to frame themselves as the defenders of worldwide democracy. To do this, they need a villain, and to fill that hole, they've chosen what they paint as evil, non-democratic regimes. All of the countries in the G7, especially America, want to unite their populations in some vague crusade for democracy, similar to the War on Terror. But these countries have a big problem. None of them are very democratic at all. In this video, we'll be looking specifically at the state of democracy in 3 of the G7 countries and the background of how these nations got to their position. This video will not be about whether I approve of democracy as a system or not. Instead, it will examine whether some of the nations who brag to the world about their alleged democratic values have the standing to do that. Number 1. Japan. The creation of the current Japanese state dates back to World War II. Prior to the war, the Japanese Empire was the only non-European great power in the world. Its government was a semi-absolute monarchy with the emperor as head of state and a powerful military that had a high degree of autonomy. The empire itself had influence from Manchuria to Guam. During World War II, the Japanese attempted to create an Asian co-prosperity sphere through conquest. They were eventually defeated when the United States pushed back their armies in the field and dropped nuclear weapons on their cities. It was the only time in history that nuclear weapons were used on human populations. In many ways, liberal democracy in Japan has its origin in the smoldering rubble of once great cities and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. Facing further nuclear annihilation, the Japanese emperor had no choice but to unconditionally surrender to the Allies in 1945. Following this, the country was occupied, the imperial government dismantled, and a new constitution was written for the country by the Western occupiers. Such writers of this new constitution included the 22-year-old feminist Beate Serrata Gordon, who wrote several articles pertaining to women's rights and anti-discrimination. Furthermore, Article 9 of the new Japanese constitution states that Japan forever renounces its right to declare war. Yes, the liberal democratic constitution of Japan removed the nation's right to declare war. This article also abolished the entire Japanese military, though a small self-defense force was allowed several decades later. This constitution has not been amended in over 70 years. All of this raises questions of legitimacy. Given that the current Japanese constitution was 1. Imposed on Japan by foreign powers, 2. Was accepted under duress, namely the threat of further nuclear bombings, and 3. Renders the Japanese state almost defenseless without foreign help, one has to wonder what liberal democracy is really all about. Today, Japan is basically a shell of a country with a declining population and one of the lowest birth rates in the world. Number 2. Italy. Italy is another nation whose current government is connected to the end of World War II. Prior to and during the war, Italy's popular government was the fascist party led by Benito Mussolini. After rising to power in a bloodless coup against the unpopular Italian parliament in 1922, Mussolini governed Italy as its prime minister for over 20 years. Mussolini's rise was due to a combination of many factors. Italy had lost over 1 million men in World War I and received almost nothing for it. This led to many Italians feeling enraged at the existing parliamentary order, which was seen as weak and ineffective. At the same time, Marxist parties were causing chaos both nationally and internationally, with strikes and revolutions happening across Europe. Germany, Hungary, Russia, and more had all experienced communist revolutions, some with more success than others. The Italian government had also left a conflict with the Catholic Church over land in Rome unresolved for over 50 years. Parliament after parliament collapsed and failed to improve Italy's tenuous situation. It tells us a lot about the state of Italy during the pre-fascist period that it was when Italian immigration out of the country to the United States exploded. If you're an Italian American, this is most likely the period your ancestors came to the United States. This was the political environment that Benito Mussolini entered into. By the time he arrived on the political scene, he was already an extremely popular journalist and veteran. His new party, the Fascisti, offered a vision for Italians that rejected both the failures of the existing order and the chaos of Marxism. When the Fascist Party asserted itself into power in the March on Rome, there was almost no popular resistance. Throughout its tenure, the Fascist Party remained popular with the Italian people. Under their leadership, Italy enjoyed two successful military campaigns, one in Ethiopia and another in Libya. It had long been an objective of the Italians to match the other European powers, and conquests in Africa were seen as key to achieving that. The fascist government also stood out from most other European nations by surviving the Great Depression. There are actually some metrics that indicate the Italian economy grew more during the Depression period than it grew in 2010's Italy. Ultimately, it would be World War II that led to the party's demise. Italy had had further dreams of conquest in the Mediterranean, but ultimately the massive Allied alliance prevented them from doing so. Though it took dozens of countries to defeat Italy and its allies, the nation was eventually occupied in 1945. Afterwards, many Italian political leaders who had been in power during the war were imprisoned or executed. The Italian Fascist Party was banned. Mussolini himself, along with dozens of other Fascist Party members, were captured by communist partisans in 1945 and shot without trial. Following the conclusion of the war, the Italian politicians who weren't imprisoned or executed oversaw the abolition of the Italian monarchy and approved a new constitution. Among this constitution's new provisions was Provision 12. It says this: "It shall be forbidden to reorganize, under any form whatsoever, the dissolved fascist party." To this very day, it exists as law that Italians may not democratically organize as fascists or anything that resembles a fascist party. Citizens who do so are legally prosecuted and politically persecuted, and some can even face jail time. So in other words, an ideology that was extremely popular in Italy for over 20 years may no longer be democratically supported. So much for democracy. This directly conflicts with the Italian constitution's provision protecting freedom of speech, but apparently to Western democracies, freedom of speech doesn't apply to some political views. The common justification for bans on political views like fascism is that they could lead to the abolition of democracy. But this begs the question of why laws like this only seem to be limited to fascism. Communist governments, for example, have frequently abolished elections through history and have a far higher death toll than fascism. Yet today in Italy, the latter is banned while the former has several registered parties. Bans like this on speech neuter serious discussions. People become scared of saying the wrong thing lest they be arrested. It creates a chilling effect that protects the status quo, regardless of how corrupt or ineffective it becomes. It also results in the censoring of unpopular facts that might have been helpful to society if they were actually considered. In any case, the fact that fascism is the only undemocratic ideology banned in Italy shows that this ban has nothing to do with democracy. Number 3. Germany. So by now you can probably tell that the three countries I've chosen are the three former Axis powers in World War II. The end of that war is when Germany's current government was created. But to get the full picture, we have to go back to the 1920s and 1930s. After Germany's surrender in World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm was forced to abdicate and the country became a republic. This system, called the Weimar Republic, was essentially a true parliamentary democratic system. Dozens of parties were able to compete for dominance, and basically no one was censored. It was within this system that the National Socialist movement rose to prominence and started outcompeting all its rivals. Like the Fascist Party in Italy, the NSDAP promised the downtrodden German people national renewal and a fresh vision. Their primary objectives were to end all foreign influence over Germany and unite the German diasporas scattered throughout Europe. As time went on, the NSDAP defeated liberals, conservatives, communists, and much more. After a combination of electoral successes and political maneuvers, they eventually shifted the government into a one-party state. While in power, the party achieved many of its goals, including promoting nationalism and uniting the German diasporas. Because of all these successes, the party's popularity was high with the German people for most of its tenure. Keeping with the trend of this video, the NSDAP government was ended during World War II. Liberal democracies worked hand in hand with communist dictatorships to destroy practically half of Germany. After the war, the nation was occupied and its territory torn asunder. The Allies occupying the nation created a new constitution and a new legal system. We notice a trend here of liberal democracies being created through brute force and mass killings. Not exactly the rosy picture that the Group of Seven wants to paint the system as. During the Allied occupation, essentially all remnants of National Socialism were removed in a process called denazification. The denazification process involved essentially brainwashing the German public into seeing themselves and their history as evil so they would abandon it and accept the new order being thrust upon them. This propaganda campaign was largely successful. Today, Section 86A of the German Criminal Code outlaws propaganda of a former National Socialist organization. Thus, you cannot legally organize as a National Socialist in Germany. You may not even sing songs that were popular with the National Socialist movement. Doing any of these things results in arrest and jail time. Much like Italy, Germany has provisions in its constitution that allow freedom of speech, but this is voided by having certain political exceptions. This raises several questions. How can a society be democratic or have freedom of speech if entire viewpoints are banned? If a sentiment has to be censored to keep it from becoming popular, what exactly is the point of democracy? Can a country even be called democratic if an entire political line of thought is forcefully kept off the table? If National Socialism is so evil and wrong, why does it need to be banned? If a party wanted to organize around something insane like electing horses to public office, there would be no need to ban them. They would simply be laughed out of existence due to the insanity of their ideas. By banning National Socialism, it implies that the powers that be in Germany and elsewhere are afraid of it catching on again. But why would it catch on again? I'll leave that question to the viewer. These are just 3 of our glorious liberal democracies. Nations who had their popular governments overthrown, their countries bombed to rubble, and their constitutions imposed on them by foreign states. The idea that these are free democracies with self-determination for their people is a joke. But in an ironic twist of fate, the victors of World War II haven't ended up much better. Initially, I only wanted to talk about the previous 3 countries, but I've changed my mind, and I'll talk about the other G7 a little bit as well. The United Kingdom and Canada, for example, suffer from an extreme lack of freedom of speech. People have been arrested in these countries for offensive internet posts. Again, how are you supposed to be democratic if people are scared to talk? France has similar laws and used them earlier this year to ban the political organization Generation Identity based purely on their speech. How is this really any different from China or Russia suppressing opposition? Western democracies are essentially in the unenviable situation where pornography that dumbs the population down is legal, while legitimate political debate that raises the public intelligence is suppressed. Meanwhile, in the United States, it's almost impossible to get into political office unless you're in one of the 2 main political parties. Third parties in the US are denied ballot access, debate opportunities, and media coverage. This makes them incredibly difficult to get off the ground, let alone to get into an office. Not very democratic. By the way, this is with a US Congress that has an average approval rating of about 25%. Meanwhile, the courts, the unelected branch of government, basically rule America. They invalidate laws at a whim and legislate from the bench with no checks and balances. The United States in recent years has also seen the rise of Antifa. It's basically a paramilitary organization that attacks grassroots right-wing organizing. Since 2017 especially, it's been protected by the courts, the media, and other American institutions of power. The United States has freedom of speech on paper, but that doesn't do much when you're being attacked in the streets and the police do nothing about it. This would all be well and good if people were allowed to actually fight back. But what has happened time and time again is that when someone defends themselves from these thugs, they're the ones who are arrested. Without this kind of institutional protection, Antifa would not be able to exist. There's of course one more gigantic issue that makes all of these countries undemocratic, and that's the power of multinational corporations. International companies have more money and power than millions of normal citizens, and they use that power to control politics. Google and other tech companies are prime examples. Their ability to move from country to country with little consequence has created a race to the bottom where governments compete for who can give them the best deals and the most power. When people say that globalists are running their countries, this is basically what they're referring to. If these countries are what liberal democracy is all about, I don't think they have any room to be criticizing China, Russia, and others. The hypocrisies of Western governments get more extreme with every passing year. As our Lord Jesus said, remove the plank from your own eye before removing the speck from your brother's eye. On a lighter note, the inherent contradictions of liberal democracies are starting to catch up to them. In past decades, the G7 made up over 80% of the world's economy. Today, that's dropped to between 30 and 40%. The powerful in these countries are losing their grip on the world order, and instead of trying to fix the problems tearing their nations apart from the inside, are painting over them with fake moral superiority. To be clear, China and Russia are authoritarian states. But in many ways, so are the Western, so-called liberal democracies. The key difference is that in China and Russia, it's made perfectly clear who's in power. It's perfectly clear to the average Chinese person that the Communist Party and President Xi are calling the shots. The fascist governments of the past also were not democratic, but they didn't pretend to be. Their belief was that the best way to protect the people was with a one-party state, and they were very open about this. In Western democracies, power is all obfuscated, hidden behind puppet politicians and figureheads who are put in front of cameras to do the bidding of the actual powers behind the scenes. So, who's really in power in the West? We may find the answer by looking for who and what people here aren't allowed to criticize. This has been Pax. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe for future content. I'll see you next time.